Guys, Otterpop here, and welcome to the first review in a series of many different kinds of new reviews. Now, I know a lot of you are still waiting on some South Park stuff, but just hear me out for a little bit. Not too long ago, I was approached by someone who suggested that I reacted to a certain show, at least the 3 seasons of a certain show, because of the possibility that it could be brought back for a 4th season. And what show am I talking about? Well, it's pretty obviously in the friggin' title of the video. I am reacting to, as well as reviewing, the series Dan vs. Now, this was a show that I'd heard of before, but I didn't know too much about. All I knew basically was that the main character's name was Dan, and he basically had a grudge against everything and wanted to take revenge against everything and anyone, or something along those lines. But since that was literally all I knew about the show, it made me kind of the perfect choice to be a blind reactor to it, and I was kind of excited a little bit at the prospect of trying to help a show that had ended kind of abruptly maybe reclaim some ground, and enough for, potential revival of a new season, at least. So before I get too much into it, I first want to apologize because I did react to the first 4 episodes out of order. Technically, I reacted to them in airing order, but that was not the intended order that they were supposed to be. The airing order in which I reacted to them was New Mexico, then Wolfman, and then Dentist, and then Ninja, when it's actually supposed to be Wolfman and then New Mexico, and then Ninja, and then Dentist. So I unfortunately reacted to the first 4 out of order accidentally because I was a little bit impatient to hear about what the intended order was. And yes, this is the intended order based on what the creators have said. I didn't hear from the creators directly, but the person who suggested that I react to this did hear directly from the creators about this, so I know it's legit. But anyways, onto the actual episode, onto the actual review of the episode. There's just a very, very quick recap of the episode, is that somebody has scratched up Dan's car, and he's pretty sure that the Wolfman did it. So he basically takes his friend Chris to find the Wolfman and basically get revenge on it. That is literally the simplest way I can possibly put of the plot of this episode, and I'm not even joking about any of this. And again, like I mentioned previously, even though I technically reacted to this one second, this is supposed to be the first episode. Dan vs. the Wolfman is supposed to be the very first episode of the show. And again, even though I reacted to these first 2 episodes out of order, I still got a very good idea of their personalities. Again, from the first 2 episodes alone. And like I said, the only thing that I really knew, or I suppose rather that I had guessed about Dan, was that he was basically just a jerk who had a grudge on everything and wanted to get revenge on anyone or anything, and I was kind of right, but there's still a little bit more to it than that. This first episode, or in a way these first 2 episodes, definitely introduced me to the 2 main characters of the show, which was, Dan on one side and Chris on the other. Dan is very much aggressive, selfish, short-tempered, a man-child, as I think I referred to him at one point. But then you have Chris, who is, very passive. He's kind of laid back, but he's also lazy at the same time, and he's a bit of a pushover. So we have the jerk, and then we have the doormat. That's literally what I kind of like referring to them as. I'm pretty sure I referred to Chris as a doormat a number of times. Or maybe just once, I don't know, but for some reason, doormat was the first word that came to mind when I was trying to think of his personality as a whole. And Dan, it's pretty obvious. It's on his shirt. Although Dan's personality did surprise me a slight bit as I was watching through the show. The first instance was I'm like, oh, he's probably a little bit of an idiot, because, he was trying to go after the Wolfman, but he captured a freaking kid in a Wolfman-type costume and didn't realize it was a kid, and, Chris was trying to say, it's just a freaking kid, it's not the actual Wolfman, but Dan didn't seem to understand until Chris started asking him, does he have claws, or something along those lines, and Dan's like, okay, fine, so I guess it's not the Wolfman. But then they had to add in a part later on in the episode that caught me completely off guard when, and I'll explain later, when Chris and Dan are basically at an archaeological site trying to dig up a bow, and they end up raising the dead, so to speak, unintentionally, but during that, or at least as they're driving away from the archaeological site, Dan just goes out of the sunroof and just yells out, Neolithic indigenous zombies, very angry, and I'm like, wait, back up, time out. How in the heck do you know those 2 words, and how did you put all that together into one coherent thing? And right on the spot, too. His intelligence, for saying that, and still confusing the kid he captured earlier for being the Wolfman, there are 2 conflicting ideas here, it absolutely made me question his intelligence on how he knew that vocabulary but still couldn't tell a kid in a wolf costume apart from the Wolfman, who is not real, but apparently is, but more on that later. But it really made me question Dan's intelligence. It made me think like, oh, he could know just about anything on anything. Like, honestly, it's a 50-50. It's a hit or miss. Anything could go. He could know this one thing or not another. I don't know. His intelligence, even at that point in the episode, just completely baffled me. Of course, there were still plenty of aspects to Dan's personality, like him immediately wanting to take revenge on the frickin' Wolfman, who was not supposed to exist, but I guess he kind of does in this universe. His ideas were completely illogical and crazy, to say the least. But for the most part, Dan's personality seemed pretty, obvious. I'm still questioning his intelligence and what he knows, but a lot of his personality seems to be pretty obvious. And his personality wasn't the only one. Chris's personality was kind of on full display as well. I mean, especially the fact that even initially in the episode, as soon as Dan called him and talked to him about the Wolfman stuff, Chris, went to go help Dan. I mean, not for a quick conversation with his wife, Elise, who we only saw a little bit throughout the episode, but more on her for another time. But it's that one little interaction between them where Chris and Elise are having a conversation, and Chris is like, here's Dan again, he's seeking revenge on something else. But by the end of the conversation where Elise is like, okay, go on and help Dan, Chris is just like, thank you, and he's like super excited to leave, but it was surprising. I mean, based on that brief interaction, like, there wasn't a lot of indication that there was any roughness necessarily with Chris and Elise's marriage in any way, because, I mean, again, they're married, it was pretty obvious. But it just struck me as a little bit interesting, because there was little indication that there was any roughness in the relationship between Chris and Elise, and yes, I know that they're married, but in this case I refer to it just as a relationship in general. There's a reason that I mentioned that. The relationship's fascinating me, but that's for another time. But there was also some indication that Chris seemed to enjoy helping out Dan with these crazy schemes and ideas, which, putting those two facts together, didn't make a lot of sense to me. And that wasn't the only time I called a character's personality into question, because there were a couple of other, little instances during the episode. Like, Dan seemingly having some morality when he refused to kill the Wolfman when he probably had a chance. But of course, those weren't the only times even during the entirety of the episode that I was calling any character's personality into question. There were plenty of other little instances as well. For example, when Dan wanted to make a little silver arrowhead, he told Chris to, give him some silver, and all of a sudden Dan has an anvil in his apartment, and he suddenly knows how to use the anvil and weld a friggin', silver coin into an arrowhead. So he's apparently got some resourcefulness and skill in that, which I just wasn't expecting. Not only that, but when he shot the arrow, it was, dead on accurate. Despite Dan just having, an intense hatred for the Wolfman because of what happened, he still seemed to have some level of morality and didn't want to actually kill the Wolfman, just do something pretty simple and mundane. But then at one point in the episode, he also gets super cross with police authority of all people. He throws a temper tantrum basically in the police station and gets super angry with the police officer, so his personality is just kind of going all kinds of back and forth, it feels like. So I guess in a way it's not really a problem with the characters themselves, maybe with partially how they're presented, but also the fact that technically this is the first episode, and at this point I'd still only seen, I'd only seen 2 episodes, which means that there's still a lot more episodes to go for potential characterization or growth. And then right at the end, Chris just sums up the episode, just perfectly. They spent a minimum of 2 months waiting to enact one of Dan's crazy contrived plans, which we didn't even fully know what he was going to do. Dan took Chris's silver dollar coin heirloom and basically turned it into an arrowhead. They stole from an archaeological dig and basically created zombies, or something to that effect. And of course, Chris's car smells like bad coffee. That too. All of that so that Dan could just key the Wolfman's car, since the Wolfman scratched up his car. Like Dan said, he scratched my car, I scratched his. That was it? For all of that crazy planning and all the ridiculousness of the entirety of the episode, and that's all Dan was gonna do in return? Yeah, Chris just basically summed up that episode perfectly, and at that point I'm like, this is what a lot of the future episodes are going to be like, isn't it? The plot of this episode, it just felt like it went one way and the other. It just went all over the place. And the characters, I mean, they were relatively grounded, it seemed, but then their personalities kind of started going all over the place. And when I'm talking about characters, of course, I am talking about Dan and Chris as the two main characters. And remember how I said how I watched New Mexico first and then this episode, and I couldn't necessarily figure out which was supposed to be the first and which was supposed to be the second. There should have been, well, there not should have been, but there was definitely a big red flag that should have clued me in as to why this particular episode was the first and not New Mexico. One word, Elise. Elise's character is, you know, she's in the episode a couple of times for a couple of quick short lines, but otherwise her character basically takes a backseat throughout the entirety of the episode, because this episode is supposed to be focused on introducing us, I mean, partially to kind of the interesting world, but also to Dan and Chris, and maybe a little bit more prominently the relationship between them, especially given how much you feel like their personalities would clash with one another, because they absolutely do. They're almost exact opposites of each other in every sense of the way. But still, even after watching this one and after watching New Mexico, even after watching those two episodes already by this point, I was still completely fascinated and curious by the relationship of these two characters, of Dan and Chris, and I wanted to explore it more. Like, it just fascinated me to no end. I mean, I especially wondered why Chris put up with Dan as much as he does, and, like, how and why they were friends, and why Chris unconsciously decides to make the decision to encourage Dan to exact revenge on the most ridiculous of things. But by this point, the characters still weren't totally solidified for me, but I was still fascinated to learn a little bit more, because, again, you wouldn't think that these two personalities would work together as well as they do, I guess you could say. But they do, and it made me kind of want to think about, well, how in the heck did all of this start? Why is this still happening? Like, what is even happening half the time? So many questions that need answers. And of course, the characters weren't the only thing I was questioning. I was kind of questioning the reality of the world too, because the Wolfman frickin' exists. There's an actual Wolfman that exists who transforms into a wolf during the full moon. That's real. But all I can chalk that up to is cartoon logic. Cartoon logic can explain a lot, honestly. It's kind of funny. And speaking of the Wolfman, there are some clearly, especially once I was rewatching it, there were some very obvious parodies throughout the entirety of this episode. I mean, firstly, it's in the freaking title, you know, Dan versus the Wolfman. Clearly parodying like all the Wolfman and werewolf films, TV. I think there are some books as well. I mean, it was interesting that the term Wolfman was used for this particular episode. I'm still wondering why, because there are lots of other terms. Werewolf, especially, being one of the most popular terms nowadays, but like, you know, a lycanthrope, wolf person, wolf walker, there are all different kinds of terms. So it was just a little bit interesting that Wolfman was the term chosen. I mean, I don't know. But there are a bunch of other little parodies throughout the entirety of the episode, like, you know, A, a Wolfman can only be seen or can only appear during a full moon, a fact which Dan recognizes. B, the next full moon that Dan can enact his revenge plan on is on Halloween night, the full moon on Halloween night, naturally. C, the fact that Dan creates a silver arrowhead and basically shoots it right into the arse of the Wolfman, but the silver arrowhead doesn't actually do anything. It doesn't actually work as legend says it should. And even in the initial part of the episode where Dan is trying to explain to Chris why it was the Wolfman, even though Chris is saying no, the Wolfman doesn't freaking exist. But Dan keeps saying, yes, this is a Wolfman, and, you know, stop living in the fantasy world, Chris. We're in reality. Which I feel like is less a parody and more of a, like, not really stereotype, but I feel like something that happens where a character in a cartoon show is like, this is reality, this is not fantasy. I feel like I've heard that a lot in a lot of cartoon shows. And there was a little bit of a not wolf-related parody where Chris and Dan are on a stakeout for the Wolfman and they end up drinking some coffee and eating donuts like you're supposed to do in a stakeout. Dan even makes mention of it too. But there were so many questions about these characters, a little bit about this world, but mostly about the characters themselves, and again, especially the relationship between Chris and Dan. So many questions, so many fascinating concepts that still have yet to be explored, and a bunch of little, like, you know, parody type stuff sprinkled in here and there that became a lot more obvious to me once I rewatched it. I'm like, oh wait, there's that. But once again, even by the time that this episode ended, and I knew that I'd still reacted to 2 of the episodes, even though this is technically the first, there were still so many burning questions in my mind. There were so many things I still wanted to know about the relationship, again, especially between Chris and Dan, but, you know, I still wanted to know more about the relationship between maybe Chris and Elise, you know, or Dan and Elise, or even all 3 of them, like how their personalities would mix and how they would play into these crazy revenge schemes. I still had so many questions, and I kind of wanted to know more. Like, this is not normally my kind of show, but for some reason I was almost slightly hooked. Like, okay, curiosity killed the cat. I mean, it's not literally gonna kill me or anything, and plus I'm not a cat, so that helps. Even the characters themselves, there are so many nuances, I feel like. There's still so much that I have yet to learn about Chris and Dan and, well, obviously Elise, since again, her character took quite a bit of a backseat in this particular episode, but I feel like I've only seen part of the picture. I need to keep watching in order to see a little bit more of their personalities. Maybe I'll even pick up on something that I haven't yet seen, but I wouldn't know for sure until I watch future episodes. So, here we are. But anyways, that is going to be the end for the review of this particular episode. I hope to keep reviewing it more and more, and I hope that the reviews are going to be going alright, because I'm not the best at reactions, well, and I'm not the best at reviews either, but I'm going to try and see what I can do, but I am still definitely going to do what I can to help bolster interest in this particular show, because it honestly does fascinate me for a variety of reasons, and, like, I have no problem reacting to the rest of it. I really don't. So anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed this. I hope you guys enjoyed the reaction as well as the review. Thank you all for watching, and as usual, until the next video, guys, check you laters.